welcome to our presentation. We are happy to be here and thank you for being here with us. Today we're presenting our research on African American women and women of color in academia. The pictures on the slide that you see reflect the possibility of women becoming leaders in positions of power, but it's not easy. It has not been easy for them to climb that ladder. As the American population, um, as the American population continues to darken, it is important to make sure the population of leaders in higher education reflect the diverse student composition of U.S. institutions. Next slide. This slide represents women who are in leadership positions across America. The top row are of those who hold positions at middle ranks of leadership, such as directors, assistant to directors, assistant to the dean, assistant to the president. The bottom row of women are in positions of presidents, but are at smaller institutions such as community colleges and smaller universities. We know that even with the changes in the demographics of our country, African American women and women of color are marginalized, excluded from consideration, stepped over, or not even considered for positions of leadership in higher education. If the population continues to change to include African Americans and other people of color in the classroom, who will represent them at the table? Who will mentor them? And who will serve as their role models at institutions of higher education? Women are often stereotyped as being less capable leaders than men, and African American women are thought to be less capable than white women or men as leaders. White women are typically picked for leadership positions, while people of authority look over African American women as leaders. White men, who typically hold the highest positions of leadership in organizations, report more acceptance of white women than African American women, suggesting they are more likely to pick white women over African American women for leadership positions. The absence of African American women in top positions in academia begins with the frequency of obstacles and setbacks, such as the intersecting dynamics of race and gender. Much of the research on women in organizations has been largely in the context of predominantly white organizations and has focused largely on the experiences of white women. There must be research that studies the development of women leaders, the difference in experiences of African American women and white women along their paths to academia and throughout their careers, and the forces that impact African American women's relationships with the dominant culture. So our research began with a qualitative study of 10 African American women and 5 white women in leadership positions. They identified barriers and mentoring experiences through their education and at the graduate level and throughout their career development. They also identified leadership qualities important to them. We use these findings to develop a survey, and that those findings are reported in Jackson and Miller, Getting and Staying in the Mainstream African American Women's Contributions to the Human Sciences.
Okay. For the qualitative stage, like Dr. Jackson mentioned, a survey was developed based on those findings, consisting of 2 newly developed scales and 1 existing scale. The first scale was the Barriers to Women Leadership Scale, or the BWLS. The 7-item scale reflects the barriers that Black women experience in academia, both while obtaining their education and in the work environment. Participants were asked to indicate their agreement and or disagreement, with 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree. Examples of the statement include, I have experienced acts of stereotyping in my work environment, and I have experienced inequality while obtaining my education. The Chromebox Alpha for the scale reported internal consistency of 0.856. The next scale was the Mentoring and Women Leaders Scale, or the MWLS. EB in 2010 defined mentoring as a developmentally oriented interpersonal relationship that is typically experienced between an individual, such as a mentor, and a less experienced individual, such as a protege. Items in this instrument were also developed and adapted from the qualitative data published in Jackson and Miller 2014 from the previous qualitative study. The 10 items were measured using a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree. Examples of the items are: mentoring provided me with positive stroking to encourage the possibility of reaching educational goals, and positive stroking to encourage the possibility of reaching work goals, and mentoring helped me recover from negative experiences in an educational and or work environment. So those were 2 separate items. The Chromebox Alpha reported internal consistency for that scale of 0.871. The final scale that we used, based on the qualitative interviews, we decided to include the multi-factor leadership questionnaire in the survey, also known as the MLQ. This 21 statement questionnaire was developed by Bass in 1985, and it posits that leadership is comprised of 3 second-order domains: transformational leadership, transactional leadership, and laissez-faire leadership. In the present study, we only utilized the second 2 domains, the transformational and transactional domains. Transformational leadership is a composite of leader behaviors that include idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. Examples of the items include: I make others feel good to be around me, and I express with a few simple words what we could and should do. The second domain, transactional leadership, consists of the latter 2 variables on the screen here: contingent reward and management by exception. Examples include: I am satisfied with when others meet agreed upon standards, and I tell others what to do if they want to be rewarded for their work. For the MLQ items, the Chromebox Alpha demonstrated internal consistencies ranging from 0.337 to 0.652. So a little bit low on that scale, and that was something that we were going to address in the second part of the study.
So two theories were used for this study: the role congruity theory and the critical race theory. The role congruity theory of prejudice suggests that women leaders experience prejudice because people tend to perceive incongruity or discrepancy between the female gender role and the potential of the leader role. We extended this theory, role congruity, because it can create perceived characteristics of populations of leaders that are built on stereotype structures from attitudes, values, and norms of the general population. Researchers suggest that the relationship between Black and white women across race, gender, and class is embedded in systems of oppression versus systems of privilege within the social structure and broader social system. Prejudice is built from the intersectionality of race, gender biases, and stereotypes, which lead others to exclude African American women from even being considered for leadership positions or even being treated positively. So, critical race theory, which represents the work of a collection of activists and scholars who are interested in studying and transforming the relationship of race, racism, and power, also supported the study's theoretical foundation. In the qualitative data collection, started this study and allowed participants to tell the story regarding their experiences as leaders in academic positions of leadership. So here you see our structural equation model, which shows barriers and mentoring in relationship to the participants' leadership style, transformational and transactional. Okay.
For the quantitative study in stage 2, the survey instrument was a multi-part online questionnaire consisting of the Barriers to Women in Leadership Scale, the Mentoring in Women Leadership Scale, and the Multi-Factor Leadership Questionnaire that measure participants' perceived barriers to leadership, their mentoring experiences, and their leadership styles. Demographic questions ask participants' age, income, ethnicity, job title, and number of years in their current position. For the sample, 2 professional women's organizations whose members were academic leaders were requested to participate via email. Snowball sampling was used as the email requested that participants pass on the message to other colleagues or peers that might also be interested in participating. For data collection, we yielded a total of 218 responses of women that voluntarily completed the questionnaire. And our breakdown of ethnicity was 132 white women and 63 women of color. So again, that's something that we want to address in the future study to increase the response rate of women of color. The data analysis, the first step was to strengthen the reliability and internal consistency on each of the 2 newly developed scales through preliminary psychometric analyses. So we used an exploratory factor analysis to do this. Then we evaluated the factor loadings, and items with loadings of less than 0.40 or double loadings were removed. And then the remaining items were analyzed again to check the influence of the modifications. The goal through this process was also to optimize scale length by assessing the trade-off between the number of items and the reliability scores. The EFA resulted in internal consistency of the barriers to women in leadership scale improving to 0.87, and the internal consistency of the mentoring and women leadership scale improving to 0.93. To test whether white women leaders differ from the African American leaders in barriers and mentoring, 2 independent t-tests were conducted. Cohen's D was computed to examine the effect size of the mean difference between African American women leaders and white women leaders, and then structural equation modeling was our last step to examine the influence of barriers and mentoring on leadership styles while controlling for race. The following table represents the independent t-test result between white women leaders and African American leaders on barriers, mentoring, and leadership style, with our N equaling 218. African American women leaders generally scored significantly higher on barriers and mentoring compared to their white counterparts. The effect size for the differences in barriers and mentoring, 0.51 and 0.48 respectively, indicated that African American women leaders experienced a medium amount more barriers and slightly more help from mentoring and leadership in contrast to the white women leaders. As to leadership styles, African American leaders scored higher on transformational leadership style with a medium effect size difference from the white leaders. Interestingly, the polychoric correlation among all study variables revealed that barrier variable was unrelated with mentoring and transactional leadership style, but significantly correlated with the transformational leadership style. The results of the structural equation model are presented in the figure on the screen. They depict the estimated model graphically. Barriers and mentoring were modestly, significantly associated with transformational leadership style. As a contrast, no association was found between the barriers, mentoring, and transactional leadership style.
So the main findings from the study are that African American women leaders scored significantly higher on barriers and mentoring compared to their white counterparts. African American women leaders experienced more barriers while in a leadership position. And in contrast, white women leaders, African American women received more help from mentors while in leadership positions. And the mentor experienced by African American leaders were provided by people such as their parents, ministers, siblings, grandparents, and teachers. And as to leadership styles, African American leaders scored higher on transformational leadership style with an effect size of 0.66 from the white leaders. And barriers and mentoring did not predict the transactional leadership style of the participants.
So the limitations, the first limitation of our study was sample recruitment for African American women participants. Although this study contacted a large number of African American participants, few actually participated. Therefore, the small sample size of N equals 63 for our women leaders who were African American warrants the need to replicate the study. We're currently brainstorming to prepare for data collection in stage 2. We're currently brainstorming additional organizations whose members might be willing to participate in the study, such as the American Association of University Women, as well as the HBCU Faculty Development Network. So the instrument also merits further refinement, which we're going to do in the second stage of our research to strengthen the reliability and the validity of the 3 scales. So that is one of the what we believe is going to be one of the major contributions of our research, is that we're going to have a robust instrument that can be used and hopefully replicated in other future research. So as I mentioned, in the present study, we are refining our scales, and we have also incorporated an additional scale that was another pre-established scale, the leadership self-efficacy scale. So we thought that that was important to gauge Black women and white women leaders' perceptions of their own leadership self-efficacy in contrast to the barriers they experience, the mentoring that's available to them, and their preferred leadership style, transformational or transactional. So we've consulted expert review on these variables. We ask a number of different, both women of color and white women in academia to review our survey and provide commentary on issues that could be strengthened or points that could be elaborated. We've done this and we've checked the reliability and internal consistency of the scales as we've made the refinements. And now we're through the process of getting IRB approval for the next stage. And then again, we're going to collect the new data. So we're going to, with the goal being to collect a more diverse sample. And then data analysis, I mentioned that we did the EFA, the exploratory factor analysis in the first stage. Data analysis in the quantitative stage, or in the second stage of the quantitative research will include a confirmatory factor analysis to test the validity and reliability again of the refined measures. And then we'll do the SEM again, the structural equation modeling, to check the influence of barriers and mentoring on leadership styles while controlling for race. And then we'll work on getting a publication out of that next study.